This video is going to demonstrate the different properties that you will encounter in math. There are about 10 of them total, and many of them you were exposed to in the previous years, so they're not going to be brand new to you. It's just a matter of remembering them, right? And along with each property, I'm going to give you a way to remember it. And if you have a better way, then you're certainly welcome to use that as well, right? And then along with that, I'm going to give you an example that goes with it. So it's the property name, the idea behind it and how to remember it, and an example for each. And again, there are a total of 10. It is a very good idea to memorize and learn these because next year when you get to math, you're going to add some new ones to it. Okay, so the more you learn now, the easier it's going to be later on. The first one we're going to start with are commutative properties. And this is what you started with learning in elementary school. It's the first one they ever show you. Right? And to help you remember what the commutative property says, I like to use the first two letters in commutative, the CO, because for me, I use the phrase change order. And you'll notice that it starts with the C and the O, the first two letters of the word commutative, right? So basically what's happening in this property is that the order is changing. Now for this property, there are two different types. There is the commutative property of multiplication and the commutative property of addition. I'm going to start with the of addition one. Right? And when you are answering a problem and naming what property it is, you do have to say commutative property of addition, right? Because there is another type and we aren't mind readers, so we can't tell which one you're trying to tell us. So in the property of addition, right, an example would look like this. If you have 6 plus 10 on one side of the equal sign, then the commutative property says you can switch the order of those two numbers and get the same answer. So if we have 10 plus 6, both sides give us the answer of 16, right? And that's what the commutative property is about, changing the order and still getting the same answer. The same idea happens in multiplication. So for the commutative property of multiplication, and that dot does represent multiplication, right? We do not use an X for multiplication any longer because that is now a letter for algebra purposes. All right, so in multiplication, if I use two numbers to demonstrate this, if I have 7 times 9, right, that answer is 63. Well, if I take those same two numbers and use the commutative property and change it to 9 times 7, the answer is still 63, right? So it works both ways. You just have to make sure that you're saying of addition or of multiplication, right? If the order changes, it is commutative, right? There will be some ones that try to trick you up a little bit, so you've got to pay attention to what's going on. The next one that you got familiar with through elementary school and even in 6th grade and below is the associative property. And for the associative property, there's a couple of ways that I can help you remember this one. If you use the two S's right at the beginning of the word, right, you can use those two S's to help you remember slip, slide. There's the S and there's the other S, right? Because what's happening in the slip slide or associative property is that the parentheses are changing. The order is not changing because that would be commutative. It's the parenthesis placement that is changing. Another way that we use to help describe this one so that you can understand it better is when you associate with people, you're pretty much their friend. So we're looking to see, did the friends on one side of the equal sign change by the time they got to the other side? All right, so I'm going to show you some examples and I'll talk you through what I'm explaining about with the friend situation. Just like commutative where it has of addition and of multiplication, this one also has associative of addition and associative of multiplication. So we'll do the addition one first. Right, so if I have the parentheses around the 2 plus 3 and then behind it is a plus 4, that's on one side of the equal sign. Well, the associative property says that the order stays exactly the same, so I still have 2 plus 3 plus 4, but what's changing are the two numbers that are inside the parentheses. This is the slip slide part. It slips off the 2 and the 3 and slides onto the 3 and the 4. Okay. If you're using the friend analogy or way to remember it, 2 and 3 are friends on the left side of the equal sign, and on the right side of the equal sign, they are no longer friends. 3 and 4 are now friends. All right. So basically, you leave one friend behind and go pick a new friend out on the other side. All right. So you need to come up with one way that's going to work for you to recognize, but the order never changes. It's only the parentheses that change when you're doing associative. So in the associative of multiplication example, it's going to look exactly the same except for it's going to use multiplication. I'm going to use the exact same three numbers and just change the sign. So over here on the left, if I have 2 times 3 in parentheses and then times 4 is behind it, that's going to equal the same thing as 2 times parentheses 3 times 4. Again, if you look on both sides, right, who's friends on the left is not the same people who are friends on the right, and that's how you know it's associative. Okay, so you do have to watch out for those parentheses. Right, the next group of properties, notice we've done 4 properties already because each type is its own, associative of addition and of multiplication. That's 2 different types. So we've done 4 already. We got 6 more. The identity properties are the next group. And just like the previous ones, there are 2 of those, one for addition and one for multiplication. Okay. But before we go into that part, the identity properties, the way I help remember this is that you get the identical answer you started with. So the word identical looks very similar to identity, right? So that's an easy way to help you remember it, right? Now, for the of addition and of multiplications, they do give you identical answers on the other side of the equal sign, but they do it differently. So you've got to be very careful. In addition, if I have the number 9, in order to get equals 9 on the other side, I have to add to it a 0. So anything that is adding 0 and you still have the same thing you started with on the other side is known as the identity property of addition. Okay? In multiplication, you can't multiply by 0 and still get the same number you started with. So that doesn't quite work. We have to use a different number when we do this. So if I take the number 15, and I want to get 15 on the other side. In multiplication, the only way that I'm going to get an identical answer is to multiply by 1. So you have to look at the left side and the right side and see how are you getting that identical answer. Are you adding 0 or are you multiplying by 1? And those are known as your identity properties. All right, so now that's 6 of them out of the way. We've got 4 more to cover. All right, the trickiest ones, in my opinion, are the inverse properties. These are the ones you tend to get confused with identity properties and other ones just because they look a little different and are not as easy to remember, but there's still ways to remember them. Okay, and the word inverse, okay, the synonym for it is opposites. So the inverse property deals with opposites. And it deals with it differently in addition versus multiplication. So once again, we're going to take a look at it as separate problems and separate properties, right? And we're going to talk about some optional names for it, right? You can say the inverse property of addition, right? But there's also another name for it. You may have been exposed in your past math experiences to the property known as the additive inverse. Okay, that's the same thing as the inverse property of addition. I don't care which one you tell me or give to me as an answer, right? Because they both mean the same thing, but you do need to recognize that both of them could show up as a possible way to identify the inverse property. All right, so for the additive inverse property or inverse property of addition, we need to take a number and add to it its opposite and see what happens. So if I take the number 10, which is a positive number, I want to add to it the opposite of 10, which would be negative 10. And when I take a number and I add its opposite, right, that cancels it out. That will always create 0 as an answer. So you need to look at your numbers and your letters and your problems and see, are you taking something and adding its opposite and getting that 0 to come out? If you are, it is the inverse property of addition. Right? Now for multiplication, it's going to look a little different. All right, so for multiplication, the other name for it, and it's a mouthful, all right, that's why we tend to use inverse property of multiplication, just because it's shorter to do all this. All right, but it is also known as the multiplicative inverse property. All right, so either one of those, again, I'll accept whichever one that you know and understand and can write, but do know that if it shows up in a multiple choice version, they are the same thing. All right, so for this inverse property of multiplication, all right, it's going to deal with the opposite of multiplication, which is division, and the way division usually looks, it's set up like fractions. All right, so this is where you may want to remember the word reciprocals, right, because that's going to be your biggest ticket to helping you get this one right. Okay, so if I have the fraction 3/4, in the inverse property of multiplication, it says I have to multiply by something to make that fraction go away. Well, to make fractions go away, we use their reciprocals. So the reciprocal, which means flip the fraction, of 3/4 is 4/3. Okay, and because I get 3/4 times 4/3, the answer will always be a 1. It makes the fraction go away, right? In other words, it X's out the numerator and denominator because they're diagonal from each other. Okay, so just understand, right, that in a fraction, if you're using the inverse property of multiplication, you want to flip it to multiply, and then that will always give you a 1 for an answer. Okay, so that now takes us through 8 properties. We have 2 more. Right? And they're a little easier to identify just because they look so different. All right, so the first one that we want to make sure that we do is the zero property. And you may see it just written plainly as zero property, and that's fine. Or you might see it written as zero property of multiplication. Right? You don't have to have the of multiplication part because this is only one property that does this. Right? And basically this property says, and you've learned this since early on in elementary school, that anything times 0 equals 0. No matter how big or ugly the item is, if you are multiplying by 0, your answer will be 0. So for an example, just to show you what I mean, if I have the term 6xyz, that's one term, 6 times x times y times z. But as soon as I take that and multiply by 0, who cares how ugly the first thing was? Anything times 0 is automatically 0. Okay, so just look for that times 0 equals 0 piece when you're doing the zero property. And the last property that you're responsible for as an 8th grade math student is known as the distributive property. Okay, and for right now, I just want you to be able to recognize this property, but along the way, throughout the year, in the upcoming months, actually in the fall, we will take and actually do the distributive property in a way to get an answer to certain problems. But right now, I just want you to be able to identify it by looking at it. Right, so the distributive property means that you are going to give, because that's what distribute means, is give one number to all numbers in parentheses. So yes, parentheses are involved in this property, but it's not the same as the associative property. The parentheses actually disappear in this one. All right, so for example, and I'm going to show you 2 of them just so you can see the difference because there are 2 different versions, right? And it can go either way, right? If I have 4 on the outside of parentheses and 6 plus 2 inside, distributing means that I'm giving that 4 to everything inside the parentheses. So on the other side of the equal sign, it's going to show you that I'm giving that 4 to the 6 and the 2. So it's going to say 4 times 6, right? Because that's the first number I gave the 4 to, plus, and now I've got to give the 4 to the 2. 4 times 2. Right? So you're looking for that number that's on the outside, or that item on the outside, to be used twice on the other side of the equal sign. Okay, now sometimes they write these backwards. You need to be able to understand both forwards and backwards. In distributive property, you are allowed to use a subtraction sign. This is the only property ever in math that a subtraction problem, or that a subtraction property, right, is involved with. None of the other properties can involve subtraction because they just don't work. Right? So for this problem, if I have 3 on the outside of parentheses and 7 minus 5 inside, and that's where the subtraction sign will be. You will never see it any other place. Right? That 3 is on the outside of parentheses, so I'm giving that 3 both to the 7 and the 5. So I need to make sure that 3 shows up in both places. So on the left side of the equal sign, it might start with 3 times 7, because you gave the 3 to the 7, put the minus sign, right? And then you're going to give the 3 to the 5. Okay, so you're looking for the fact that it used the 3, which was the number on the outside, twice. Up here in the first one, the 4 was on the outside, so we were looking to see where the 4 was used twice. Anytime that happens, that's known as your distributive property. Right? In class, we'll be doing some activities with this, and we'll be making your own set of flashcards to help you remember these and to study off of. You will experience a property quiz in the upcoming days, right, to test your knowledge of how well you know them and how well you can recognize them. Okay, so constantly use these notes as a reminder, right, and a helpful way to remember these properties.